September 15th, 1916. If a 29-year-old cavalry lieutenant named George Smith Patton hadn't commandeered 3 Dodge touring cars that morning, the United States Army would have lost its first motorized combat operation before it even began. Not failed, not retreated, lost. The man who would one day be called Old Blood and Guts was about to change warfare forever, and he didn't even know it yet. This wasn't supposed to be his mission. George Smith Patton was a cavalry officer, a horse soldier, serving under General John J. Pershing in the dusty hell of northern Mexico. The United States had sent troops across the border to hunt down Pancho Villa, the revolutionary bandit who had dared to raid American territory. For months, Pershing's expedition had chased shadows through the Chihuahua Desert. Villa remained a ghost. But Lieutenant George Smith Patton wasn't interested in chasing ghosts. He wanted blood. On that September morning, Patton stood outside Pershing's headquarters at Dublin, watching supply trucks rumble past. These weren't cavalry horses. These were machines, loud, smelly, unreliable machines that most officers dismissed as toys. But Patton saw something different. He saw speed. He saw surprise. He saw the future. Intelligence had just arrived. Julio Cardenas, one of Villa's top lieutenants, was hiding at a ranch near San Miguelito, just 15 miles south. This wasn't just another bandit. Cardenas was Villa's personal bodyguard, his most trusted killer. If the United States forces could capture or kill him, it would be a devastating blow to Villa's organization. Every cavalry officer in camp wanted this mission, but cavalry was slow. By the time horses covered 15 miles, word would spread. Cardenas would vanish like morning mist. George Smith Patton had a different idea. He approached Pershing with a proposal so radical that other officers called it insane. "Sir," Patton said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "give me 3 automobiles and 10 men. I'll bring you Cardenas." Pershing studied the young lieutenant. George Smith Patton was different from other officers. He came from wealth, from California aristocracy. Yet he had the fighting spirit of a street brawler. He'd been born into privilege but had spent his entire life preparing for war. He read military history like other men read novels. He practiced shooting until his hands bled. He believed, truly believed, that he was destined for military greatness. "Automobiles?" Pershing raised an eyebrow. "For combat? For speed, sir. Cavalry will take hours. I can be there and back before Villa's scouts even know we've left camp." The stakes were enormous. The United States expedition into Mexico was becoming an embarrassment. President Woodrow Wilson faced mounting pressure to withdraw. American newspapers mocked the military's inability to catch a bandit. The United States, WAMSI's, Army's reputation was crumbling with each passing day. Pershing made his decision. "Take the cars, but Patton, this is your neck on the line." George Smith Patton saluted sharply. "Yes, sir. I wouldn't want it any other way." Little did anyone know that this 29-year-old lieutenant was about to conduct the first motorized combat raid in United States military history. What happened in the next 6 hours would echo through the decades, influencing tank warfare in 2 world wars and establishing principles still taught at military academies today. They called him many things in those early days: reckless, ambitious, glory-hungry. But soon, they would call him something else entirely. They would call him Old Blood and Guts, a name earned not through words but through leading from the front, through charging into battle while other officers commanded from safety, through spilling his own blood alongside his men time and again. But that nickname was still years away. On this September morning, George Smith Patton was simply a young lieutenant with 3 automobiles, 10 soldiers, and an unshakable belief that he was about to make history. He was right, but first, Old Blood and Guts, though no one called him that yet, was about to face his first real test of combat leadership. And the world was about to witness what motorized warfare could truly accomplish. This is what happened next. The 3 Dodge touring cars sat in the Mexican sun like metal ovens. George Smith Patton selected his team carefully. 10 soldiers, all volunteers, all expert marksmen. He chose men who wouldn't hesitate when bullets started flying. In his mind, Patton had already visualized every possible scenario: victory, failure, death. He was prepared for all of them, but the other officers weren't prepared to see Patton succeed. "You're wasting gasoline," Major Ryan told him as Patton loaded ammunition into the vehicles. "Cardenas will be long gone before you arrive." "Then I'll chase him down," George Smith Patton replied without looking up. "With automobiles? They'll hear you coming from miles away. Those engines sound like thunder." Patton finally met Ryan's eyes. "Good. Let them hear. Speed beats silence when you're hunting men." The skepticism was universal. Cavalry officers especially viewed Patton's plan as betrayal. Abandoning the horse for the machine was like abandoning honor itself. But George Smith Patton had studied military history obsessively. He knew that every major tactical innovation faced ridicule before acceptance. The stirrup, the longbow, the rifle, now the automobile. At precisely 0800 hours on September 15, 1916, the three-car convoy rolled out of Dublin. Patton rode in the lead vehicle, a pistol on each hip. Not the famous pearl-handled revolvers of his later years, but standard-issue Colt .45s. His face was set in grim determination. The drive south was brutal. Mexican roads in 1916 barely deserved the name. The Dodges bounced through ruts, scraped over rocks, and churned through sand that grabbed at their wheels like quicksand. Twice they had to stop and dig vehicles free. Each delay gnawed at Patton's confidence. Every minute lost meant Cardenas could be mounting his horse, riding away, disappearing into the vast Mexican wilderness. But George Smith Patton pushed forward. Turning back was never an option in his mind. Failure was worse than death. This belief, this absolute refusal to accept defeat, would one day define Old Blood and Guts as the most aggressive, most feared combat commander the United States had ever produced. After 2 hours of punishing travel, they approached the Rubio Ranch at San Miguelito. Patton signaled the drivers to stop. He studied the compound through binoculars, adobe buildings, corrals. No obvious signs of life. Too quiet. "Could be a trap," whispered Sergeant Joe Angelo, the soldier beside him. "Could be," George Smith Patton agreed. Only one way to know for certain. He made a decision that would become his trademark in future battles. Attack immediately, with overwhelming aggression before the enemy could organize. Hesitation killed more soldiers than bullets. "All vehicles, straight into the compound, maximum speed, spread out when we enter. Dismount and secure all exits. Anyone armed is hostile." The engines roared. The three Dodges charged forward like mechanical cavalry, throwing up plumes of dust. They crashed through the ranch gate, tires screaming, and slid to stops in the courtyard. George Smith Patton was first out of his vehicle, both pistols drawn. His men fanned out with military precision. They kicked open doors, searched buildings, found nothing. Cardenas wasn't there, but someone had been there recently. Cooking fires still smoked. Food sat half-eaten on tables. Horses stood in corrals, still saddled. "They knew we were coming," Angelo said. Patton's jaw clenched. Had the entire operation been for nothing? Had his radical gamble with automobiles failed before it truly began? Then one of his soldiers shouted, "Movement! Southwest corner!" 3 Mexican men burst from a barn, sprinting toward horses. One of them, tall, heavily armed, looked back. For just a second, his eyes locked with Patton's. Julio Cardenas. In that frozen moment, George Smith Patton faced his destiny. This wasn't practice anymore. This wasn't academy training or theoretical warfare. This was real combat, his first real combat. Every future battle, every tank assault across France, every dash through Sicily, every impossible relief of Bastogne would trace back to this moment. The man who would become Old Blood and Guts, the general who would terrify German commanders and inspire American soldiers, was about to be born in gunfire and blood. Cardenas reached his horse. His 2 companions opened fire. Bullets cracked through the air, spanging off automobile metal. George Smith Patton didn't hesitate, didn't take cover, didn't retreat. He charged straight at them, both pistols blazing. "With me!" he roared to his men. "Take them down!" What happened in the next 90 seconds would be dissected by military historians for the next century. But in that moment, there was no time for analysis. There was only action. This was the birth of Old Blood and Guts. This was the moment George Smith Patton discovered what he was truly made of. And Julio Cardenas was about to discover that he'd chosen the wrong opponent. The firefight erupted with savage intensity. Julio Cardenas and his two bodyguards, later identified as Juan Garza and Jose Perez, had the advantage of position. They'd reached their horses and had cover behind the corral fence. But George Smith Patton had something they didn't: men trained for this exact scenario, and a commander willing to lead from the absolute front. "Suppress fire! Suppress fire!" Patton shouted, advancing while shooting. His training took over. Feet planted, arms extended, controlled trigger pulls. One of his rounds caught Garza in the shoulder. The man spun and fell. But Cardenas was Villa's most dangerous lieutenant for good reason. While his companions provided covering fire, he swung onto his horse and spurred it toward open desert. If he escaped, the entire mission would be a failure. Worse than failure, it would be proof that automobiles were useless in combat. George Smith Patton made a split-second decision that would define his tactical philosophy forever. Never let the enemy dictate the terms of battle. "Angelo, with me, back to the cars." While most of his men continued engaging the two remaining bandits, Patton sprinted back to the lead Dodge. He jumped into the driver's seat. Not the passenger seat, the driver's seat. Officers didn't drive. Officers commanded from safe positions. But George Smith Patton wasn't most officers. He cranked the engine. The Dodge roared to life. Sergeant Angelo tumbled into the passenger seat as Patton floored the accelerator. The automobile lunged forward, chasing Cardenas across open terrain. A horse versus an automobile. The past versus the future. And Lieutenant George Smith Patton was betting everything on the future. The desert floor was treacherous. Rocks, cacti, arroyos that could break an axle. Cardenas rode with desperate skill, zigging and zagging, trying to reach rougher terrain where the automobile couldn't follow. The horse was agile, but the Dodge was faster. George Smith Patton drove like a demon, one hand on the wheel, one hand gripping his pistol. The distance closed, 300 yards, 200, 150. "Can you get a shot?" Patton yelled over the engine roar. Angelo braced his rifle against the windshield frame. The Dodge bounced violently. Aiming was nearly impossible. He fired 3 times. Missed all 3. Cardenas twisted in his saddle and returned fire. A bullet punched through the Dodge's hood. Another shattered the windshield. Glass exploded across Patton's face. Blood streaked his cheek. He didn't slow down, didn't flinch. He pushed the Dodge harder. This was the moment, the defining moment. George Smith Patton could have pulled back, could have let Cardenas escape, could have returned to camp and reported enemy evaded capture. No one would have blamed him. But the man who would become old blood and guts didn't know how to quit. "Hold steady," Patton screamed. He yanked the wheel hard right, cutting across Cardenas's line of escape. The Dodge skidded sideways. Angelo fired. The shot caught Cardenas's horse in the flank. The animal screamed and stumbled. Cardenas tumbled from the saddle. He rolled, came up with his rifle, and fired at point-blank range. The bullet passed so close to George Smith Patton's head that he felt the heat. Patton slammed the brakes. The Dodge stopped in a cloud of dust. Both men leaped out. Now it was face to face. No automobiles, no horses, just two warriors and their weapons. Julio Cardenas was a veteran of dozens of battles. He'd survived the Mexican Revolution's bloodiest engagements. He'd killed federal soldiers, rival revolutionaries, and bounty hunters. He was fast, experienced, and fighting for his life. George Smith Patton was 29 years old. This was his first real gunfight. Every battle, every commendation, every legend that would eventually surround the name Old Blood and Guts depended on the next 3 seconds. They raised their weapons simultaneously. Both fired. Cardenas's shot went wide, rushed, panicked. George Smith Patton's shot did not. His bullet struck Cardenas' center mass. The Mexican lieutenant staggered. Patton fired again and again. Cardenas collapsed. Sergeant Angelo was already running forward. "Lieutenant, behind you." Patton spun. One of Cardenas's companions, Perez, who had managed to mount his horse, was charging at them, firing wildly. Angelo and Patton both opened fire. Multiple rounds struck Perez. He fell from his horse, dead before hitting the ground. The desert fell silent, except for the Dodge's idling engine. George Smith Patton stood in the blood-soaked sand, breathing hard, his heart hammering. His first combat, his first kills. This was what he'd trained for his entire life, and it felt exactly as he'd imagined: brutal, chaotic, and absolutely necessary. Back at the ranch, his remaining soldiers had overwhelmed Garza, capturing him alive. The firefight was over. The mission was complete, but George Smith Patton wasn't satisfied with just tactical success. "Strip the bodies," he ordered. "We're taking them back." Angelo stared at him. "Sir, evidence, proof. We're taking Cardenas back to General Pershing. I want every officer who doubted this mission to see exactly what automobiles can accomplish." What George Smith Patton did next shocked his men. He personally helped load the 3 bodies across the hoods of the Dodges, strapped down like hunting trophies. It was brutal. It was theatrical. It was pure Patton. The return convoy rolled into Dublin at 1400 hours. Soldiers stopped and stared. Officers emerged from headquarters. General John J. Pershing himself came out to witness the spectacle. 3 Dodge automobiles, bullet-scarred and dust-covered, with dead Mexican bandits strapped to their hoods. And leading them, Lieutenant George Smith Patton, blood dried on his face, uniform torn, eyes burning with fierce pride. The impossible mission had succeeded. But more than that, George Smith Patton had just proven that motorized warfare wasn't just viable. It was devastating. Major Ryan, the same officer who'd mocked the plan that morning, approached slowly. He examined Cardenas's body, then looked at Patton with new respect. "I'll be damned, Lieutenant. You actually did it." "Yes, sir," George Smith Patton replied, and the United States Army just won its first motorized combat engagement. Word spread through camp like wildfire. The cavalry lieutenant who'd taken 3 automobiles and hunted down Villa's most dangerous lieutenant. The officer who'd driven through enemy fire. The warrior who'd killed in face-to-face combat. But this was just the beginning. What George Smith Patton had learned in 6 hours of Mexican desert combat would shape 3 decades of military innovation. He'd discovered that speed and aggression could overwhelm superior numbers. That mobility was a weapon itself. That leading from the front, putting yourself in the same danger as your men, earned loyalty that no speech could match. These lessons would turn young Lieutenant George Smith Patton into General George Smith Patton, commander of armored divisions in World War II. The same principles he'd proven with 3 Dodges in Mexico, he would later apply with thousands of tanks in Europe. The man they would call Old Blood and Guts had been born in the dust and blood of San Miguelito. The nickname wouldn't come for years, but the spirit behind it, the absolute refusal to command from safety, the willingness to bleed alongside his men, the aggressive pursuit of victory at any cost, was forged on September 15, 1916. And the world of warfare would never be the same. The aftermath of the San Miguelito raid created shockwaves far beyond a dusty Mexican camp. George Smith Patton became an overnight sensation, not just within the United States military, but across American newspapers hungry for heroes in a frustrating campaign. General Pershing summoned Patton to his private quarters that evening. The young lieutenant stood at attention, exhausted but exhilarated. His uniform still bore the stains of combat. "Sit down, Patton," Pershing said quietly. "You've earned it." George Smith Patton sat, barely able to contain his energy. "What you did today," Pershing continued, "wasn't just a successful raid. You've demonstrated a completely new form of warfare, the automobile as a weapons platform. I've been receiving telegrams from Washington all afternoon. They want details. They want specifications. They want to know if this can be replicated." "It can, sir," Patton replied instantly. "With proper training, proper vehicles, and proper tactics, motorized units could revolutionize cavalry operations. Speed is everything in modern warfare. Horses are magnificent, but they can't match mechanical speed." Pershing studied the young officer. "You do realize you've probably just made yourself obsolete? If automobiles replace cavalry, what happens to cavalry officers?" George Smith Patton's answer revealed the mindset that would define his entire career. "Then we become automobile officers, sir. War evolves. The officer who refuses to evolve dies, or worse, becomes irrelevant." This wasn't just tactical innovation. This was philosophical revolution, and Pershing recognized it. "I'm recommending you for promotion and commendation, but more importantly, I'm assigning you to work with our motor transport units. I want you to develop doctrine for motorized combat operations." For George Smith Patton, This was validation beyond measure, but the impact extended far beyond one man's career. News of the raid reached the United States within days. The New York Times ran the headline, "Pershing's Auto Cavalry Kills Villa Aide." The Washington Post called it the first motor bandit hunt in history. Suddenly, the struggling Mexican expedition had a victory to celebrate. More importantly, military strategists began asking profound questions. If automobiles could conduct raids in Mexico, what could they accomplish on a European battlefield? The Great War was raging in France. Trench warfare had created stalemate. Mobility was dead. Or was it? George Smith Patton had inadvertently demonstrated that mechanical mobility could break the stalemate. When the United States entered World War I 8 months later, in April of 1917, military planners remembered the lieutenant who'd proven that motorized units could attack with devastating effect. But the true climax of this story wasn't the raid itself. It was what George Smith Patton did with the lessons he'd learned. In November of 1917, now promoted to captain, Patton was assigned to the newly formed United States Tank Corps. Tanks were primitive, unreliable, and controversial. Most officers viewed them as mechanical jokes, but George Smith Patton saw them as the natural evolution of what he'd started in Mexico. 3 Dodge automobiles had become his proving ground. Now he would take those principles, speed, aggression, shock action, leading from the front, and apply them to armored warfare. He trained his tank crews with the same philosophy he'd used at San Miguelito. Attack aggressively, move fast, never give the enemy time to react. When skeptics said tanks were too slow, he pushed for better designs. When critics said tanks couldn't coordinate with infantry, he developed new tactics. When commanders suggested tanks should operate from rear positions, George Smith Patton personally led tank assaults, standing exposed in his command tank, directing fire under enemy bombardment. The spirit of old blood and guts, though that nickname still hadn't emerged, was being forged in the crucible of World War I. Every innovation traced back to those 6 hours in Mexico. At the Battle of San Miguel in September of 1918, now Major Patton led 144 tanks in the first American tank attack in history. He directed operations while walking ahead of his tanks, completely exposed to German artillery and machine gun fire. When a tank became stuck, he personally helped dig it out, while shells exploded around him. When communications broke down, he ran between tanks delivering orders by hand. His superior officer found him standing on a parapet, directing tank movements while enemy fire kicked up dirt at his feet. "Major Patton, get down before you're killed!" George Smith Patton's response became legendary. "I can't command from a hole in the ground, sir." This was old blood and guts in action, though the name still hadn't been coined. This was the direct descendant of the 29-year-old lieutenant who charged Julio Cardenas while bullets shattered his windshield. Then came the Meuse-Argonne offensive, September 26, 1918. George Smith Patton led his tank brigade in a massive assault against German positions. He was walking ahead of his tanks, always ahead, always visible to his men, when German machine gun fire swept the battlefield. A bullet struck him in the left thigh, tearing through muscle. George Smith Patton collapsed in a shell crater. His men rushed to evacuate him. "No!" Patton shouted, bleeding heavily. "Leave me! Keep the attack moving! Don't stop!" He lay in that crater for hours, refusing evacuation, while he continued directing tank movements by runner. Only when the objective was secured and his tanks had pushed through did he allow medics to carry him to an aid station. For this action, for leading from the absolute front, for refusing evacuation while wounded, for placing mission success above personal safety, George Smith Patton received the Distinguished Service Cross, the United States military's second highest decoration for valor. But more than medals, he'd proven a philosophy, that leaders must lead from where the danger is greatest, that soldiers follow the officer who shares their risks, that courage is a force multiplier more powerful than any weapon. The nickname, Old Blood and Guts, would emerge years later, during World War II, when soldiers noticed that General Patton's aggressive tactics cost blood, his own blood and his men's blood, but achieved results that saved far more lives in the long run. The name stuck because it captured the essential truth. George Smith Patton demanded sacrifice, but he sacrificed himself first. And it all started with 3 automobiles in the Mexican desert. The raid at San Miguelito on September 15, 1916, created ripples that would reshape military doctrine for decades. But the immediate aftermath revealed just how revolutionary George Smith Patton's achievement truly was. Within the United States Army, debate raged. Traditional cavalry officers saw the raid as an interesting anomaly, nothing that could replace the horse in sustained operations. But a younger generation of officers recognized something profound. Warfare had fundamentally changed. Colonel John L. Hines, writing in the United States Army Infantry Journal in early 1917, stated, "Lieutenant Patton's motorized raid demonstrates that internal combustion engines can deliver shock action previously reserved for cavalry charges. The implications for future warfare are staggering." German military observers, Germany was not yet at war with the United States, took notice too. Captured German intelligence documents from World War I, later examined by historians, showed that German general staff had studied the Mexico raid intensely. One report noted, American officer Patton demonstrated that motorized vehicles can conduct offensive operations with cavalry speed, but greater firepower. This represents potential paradigm shift if applied to armored vehicles. Ironically, the Germans learned from George Smith Patton's innovation faster than the United States did. When Germany developed its blitzkrieg tactics in the 1930s, rapid armored assaults that smashed through Poland and France, those tactics descended directly from principles Patton had proven in Mexico 20 years earlier. But for George Smith Patton himself, San Miguelito was transformative on a personal level. His wife, Beatrice, received a letter from him dated September 17, 1916. Parts of it revealed the young officer's thoughts immediately after his first combat. "Darling Beatrice, I have just experienced what I was born for. Today I finally understand why I have studied war my entire life. When Cardenas and I faced each other, I felt no fear, only clarity. This is my purpose. This is what I was created to do." This self-awareness, this absolute certainty of destiny, would drive George Smith Patton through 3 decades of military service. Lesser men might have been traumatized by their first kill. Patton felt validated. The tactical innovations from San Miguelito shaped United States military doctrine in measurable ways. After World War I, the United States Army Cavalry School at Fort Riley began incorporating motorized warfare training. By 1920, cavalry officers were required to study the Patton Principles, a set of motorized combat doctrines directly derived from the Mexico raid. These principles included 1. Speed and surprise overwhelm superior defensive positions. 2. Motorized units must attack aggressively, never defensively. 3. Commanders must lead from the front to maintain momentum. 4. Mechanical failures are expected. Successful operations plan for them. 5. Shock action, hitting hard and fast, paralyzes enemy decision-making. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, these principles became the foundation for armored warfare, and the officer who'd pioneered them in Mexico was perfectly positioned to revolutionize them on a massive scale. General George Smith Patton, now commanding armored divisions with thousands of tanks instead of 3 automobiles, applied San Miguelito's lessons to conquer Sicily in 1943. His Third Army's dash across France in 1944 averaged 30 miles per day, unprecedented speed that German commanders couldn't counter. And his relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, when he turned 3 divisions 90 degrees in 48 hours and attacked through a blizzard, was San Miguelito multiplied by a factor of thousands. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, captured after Germany's defeat, was interviewed by Allied intelligence officers. Asked which Allied general he'd feared most, von Rundstedt didn't hesitate. "Patton, always Patton. He understood what we understood. That hesitation is death. He attacked like a man possessed. His tank divisions moved like nothing I'd seen except our own blitzkrieg. He was our most dangerous opponent." Another captured German general, Fritz Bayerlein, who'd served under Rommel in Africa, offered this assessment. "Patton was the only Allied general who truly frightened us. He fought the way we fought, aggressively, ruthlessly, with absolute commitment to offensive action. But more than that, he was always there, at the front, visible to his men. We called him that crazy blood and guts general because he never commanded from safety. There it was. The nickname, emerging from German respect and American soldier slang, old blood and guts. The general whose tactics cost blood and demanded guts, but who gave both himself before asking them of his men. By war's end, George Smith Patton commanded the Third Army, 500,000 soldiers and thousands of tanks. His operational principles, teaching motorized aggression and leadership from the front, had helped crush Nazi Germany, and every tactic traced its lineage back to a single afternoon in Mexico, when a 29-year-old lieutenant had driven 3 automobiles into history. The United States Army's official history of World War II, published in Decided's 1953, included this passage. General Patton's innovative employment of armored forces revolutionized American military doctrine. His aggressive philosophy, emphasizing speed and shock action, directly contributed to the European victory. The foundational principles of his approach were established during the Mexican Expedition of 1916, when then Lieutenant Patton conducted the United States Army's first motorized combat raid. Military historians continue debating Patton's legacy today. His methods were controversial, his personality was abrasive, his aggressive tactics cost American lives. But the consensus remains. He was one of history's most effective combat commanders, and his innovations in motorized warfare changed how wars are fought. And it all started with 3 Dodge touring cars on September 15, 1916. So, why does the story of 29-year-old George Smith Patton's raid matter today, more than a century later? Because it reveals the precise moment when one of history's greatest military minds was born. Not in a classroom, not in an academy, but in the crucible of actual combat. Before San Miguelito, Patton was theory and ambition. After San Miguelito, he was proof and purpose. Modern military strategists still study the raid. The United States Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth includes the operation in its curriculum on tactical innovation. Not because killing 3 bandits in Mexico was strategically significant, Villa remained at large for years, but because the raid demonstrated principles that apply to contemporary warfare. In the age of drones, cyber warfare, and artificial intelligence, George Smith Patton's core insight remains valid. New technology requires new tactics, and commanders must be willing to risk everything on unproven methods. The junior officer who dares to innovate today might become the general who changes warfare tomorrow. But beyond tactical lessons, the San Miguelito raid reveals character. When bullets shattered his windshield, George Smith Patton didn't flinch. When Cardenas fired at point-blank range, old blood and guts, though not yet called that, fired back. This wasn't recklessness. This was a man absolutely certain of his purpose, willing to die, fulfilling it. That certainty carried him through 3 decades of warfare. In World War II, when staff officers suggested safer command positions, General Patton refused. "The men must see me at the front," he'd say. "They must know I share their danger." This philosophy cost him. He was wounded multiple times throughout his career. He exposed himself to artillery fire, aerial bombardment, and small arms fire countless times. Some critics called it showboating. His defenders called it leadership. But the soldiers who served under George Smith Patton understood the truth. Private First Class Paul Gouzeau, who served in the Third Army during the Dash Across France, later wrote, "We'd follow old blood and guts anywhere. Not because we loved him, half of us didn't, but because he'd never ask us to go where he wouldn't lead." You can't argue with a general who bleeds alongside you. That nickname, old blood and guts, perfectly captured the bargain Patton offered his men. "Follow me into hell, and I'll lead the way. We'll spill blood, mine, yours, the enemy's, but we'll win." That was the deal, and he kept it, from Mexico to Germany. The 3 Dodge automobiles that George Smith Patton drove into combat were never preserved. They were regular transport vehicles, returned to service, eventually scrapped. No monument marks the spot where Cardenas fell. The Rubio Ranch at San Miguelito is now private property, unremarkable desert land that tourists never visit. But the legacy? That's eternal. Every tank commander who leads from the front is channeling George Smith Patton. Every officer who adopts emerging technology despite ridicule is following his example. Every soldier who refuses to quit when the mission seems impossible is embodying the spirit of old blood and guts. The United States military teaches Patton's principles at every level of command training, not just the tactical specifics, but the philosophy. Be aggressive, lead from danger. Never let the enemy dictate terms. Speed and violence of action overwhelm superior numbers. These maxims, proven in Mexican desert on September 15, 1916, remain doctrine today. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: history is made by individuals willing to risk everything on their convictions. George Smith Patton believed motorized warfare would revolutionize combat. He was mocked, he was doubted, he was called reckless. He was also right. At 29 years old, he saw the future of warfare more clearly than generals with 30 years' experience. At 29, he had the courage to gamble his life and career on that vision. At 29, George Smith Patton became the prototype for every innovative combat leader who followed. When he died in December of 1945, ironically from injuries sustained in a car accident, not in combat, the outpouring of grief from soldiers worldwide testified to his impact. Men who'd cursed his name during brutal training exercises wept at his funeral. German officers who'd fought against him sent condolences. The United States Army had lost one of its greatest warriors. But old blood and guts left something permanent behind, proof that courage, innovation, and absolute commitment to mission accomplishment can overcome any obstacle. That leaders who share their soldiers' dangers earn loyalty no rhetoric can match. That the impossible becomes possible when someone refuses to accept impossibility. This is why we remember the raid at San Miguelito. Not because 3 bandits died in the desert, but because a philosophy was born that would help. To save the world from fascism 3 decades later. General George Smith Patton once said, "No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor bastard die for his country." That quote, that aggressive, uncompromising mindset, started when a 29-year-old lieutenant charged into his first firefight and emerged victorious. They called him Old Blood and Guts because he bled and demanded guts from others. But he earned that nickname through decades of leading from the front, of taking bullets and shrapnel, of commanding from the place where death was most likely. And it all began with 3 automobiles, 10 soldiers, and a young officer who refused to let anyone tell him that the future was impossible. The United States needed George Smith Patton in 1944 when Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable. But America got that warrior because Mexico shaped him in 1916. The battles he'd fight decades later were won on the day he learned that speed, aggression, and personal courage could achieve the impossible. That's the legacy. That's why this story matters. That's why General George Smith Patton, Old Blood and Guts himself, remains one of military history's most studied, most controversial, and most effective combat commanders. If this story of how 29-year-old George Smith Patton became America's first motorized combat hero moved you, if it showed you that one person's courage and innovation can reshape history, then you understand why we tell these stories. Hit subscribe. We're bringing you more untold moments from the life of General George Smith Patton, Old Blood and Guts, the warrior who proved that the future belongs to those brave enough to seize it, even when everyone says it's impossible. This was how a legend was born. This was the birth of Old Blood and Guts. This was the day that changed warfare forever.